So today, we're in part 2 of a 2-part podcast talking about 5 reasons why Jesus' teaching changed the world. And last week, we talked about how Jesus taught and why Jesus taught. So if you missed that episode, I'd really encourage you to go back and check it out. But today, we're going to begin by talking about something that radically impacted our world: who Jesus taught. And who did Jesus teach? Well, quite frankly, he taught everybody. Now, this is big, people. Some of you remember the story of Mary and Martha. Luke says that Mary sat at Jesus' feet. And a lot of people read that story in our day and think it's about Martha having an activist temperament and Mary having a contemplative temperament. And that's true. But nobody in the first century would have taken it that way. You see, to sit at somebody's feet was a technical phrase meaning, I've become a disciple of this rabbi. The other time that it's used in the New Testament, it says Paul sat at the feet of Gamaliel. It means I have enrolled in this rabbi's school, which means Jesus has taken Mary, a woman, to be his disciple. And you know what? He would also teach Samaritans. He would teach children. He would teach Gentiles. And this focus on educating everyone would actually change our world. Before Jesus left this earth, he said to his followers in Matthew 28:18-20, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Okay, that would be a lot of authority. And nobody else said that. Socrates never said that. Confucius never said that. The Buddha never said that. Jesus said this. All authority has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, all people, teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And you know what? His followers actually took this seriously, and it changed the world. We're told in Acts 5:42, day after day, in the temple courts and from house to house, they never stopped teaching. They began a process of education called catechesis. You ever heard of the word catechism before? Well, that's a Latin word from Rome. About AD 150, a man named Justin Martyr formed schools in Ephesus and Rome. Now, you got to understand, Rome and Greece valued learning, but formal education was always reserved for male children of wealthy families. That's kind of the cultural elite. But the church remembered, hey, we follow this guy who taught everybody. And so they would teach male and female, slaves and free. And this idea, it kept percolating until in the Protestant Reformation, a guy by the name of Martin Luther emphasized from the New Testament the idea of the priesthood of all believers. And folks, this had a profound impact on education. Luther said every person needs to be able to read and write so that they can study the scriptures for themselves, because we're all priests now. And that led to a goal of universal literacy for everyone. Martin Luther was so fired up about this, he said he would write a book about parents who neglect the education of their children. Listen to what Luther said. He said, quote, I shall really go after the shameful, despicable, damnable parents who are not parents at all, but despicable hogs and venomous beasts devouring their own young. Luther obviously had a hard time expressing his emotion. Wow. But you see, he was fired up about this. But the idea of universal public education had its primary birth here. The Jesus movement put a huge stamp on education in our country. In America, the first law to require mass universal education was in Massachusetts in 1647. It was called, believe it or not, the Old Deluder Satan Act. Isn't that a great name for a piece of legislation? We don't have snappy names like that for legislation in our day. But this is what they said. Quote, it being one chief end of that old deluder Satan to keep men from the knowledge of the scriptures, and to the end that learning may not be buried in the graves of our forefathers. See, they had this beautiful vision that everybody ought to learn, that ignorance is the devil's tool, and that God is a God of truth. And so they said, now all towns are going to have to fund education. You know, many people have heard of Sunday school, but most have no idea where it came from. See, in 1780, a Jesus follower named Robert Raikes could not stand the cycle of poverty and ignorance that was destroying little children, a whole generation. And so he said, the world marches forward on the feet of little children. And so he took children who actually had to work 6 days a week in squalor. Sunday was their free day. And so he said, I'm going to start a school for free to teach them to read and write and learn about God. Well, he did. And he called it Sunday school. You know, within 50 years, there were 1.5 million children being taught by 160,000 volunteer teachers who had a vision for the education of a generation. It was one of the great educational volunteer triumphs of the world, inspired by this rabbi who lived 2,000 years ago, Jesus. You know, I was wondering the last couple of days, what if Jesus were to tap a bunch of people on the shoulder, and what happened with Justin Martyr and Martin Luther and Robert Raikes were to happen in our backyards today, and literacy levels and graduation rates were to skyrocket. I mean, aren't you grateful for people who teach or volunteer in schools? I mean, what if the Jesus movement exploded so every child could discover their mind's full potential? Okay, next, let's talk about what Jesus taught. What Jesus taught. A couple verses on this one. Jesus says, when you apply his teaching, quote, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. That's John 8:32. And then right before he dies, Jesus is talking to Pilate. And he says this about his mission in John 18:37-38. Quote, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. And of course, the classic Pilate says, what is truth? What is truth? Pilate asked. You know, that's the great question of our day. What is truth, and can it really be known? You know, there are all kinds of debates about this, because whoever actually does have truth will have authority, which, by the way, is why it's such an explosive subject. Somebody once asked Jesus, which is the greatest commandment? And Jesus does a surprising thing. Okay, he quotes an Old Testament verse from Deuteronomy. This would be Deuteronomy 6:5, that every devout Israelite knew. He says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. Okay? But Jesus does a staggering thing for a rabbi. What he says in the Matthew version, Matthew 22:37, is this: love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. Did you notice what word Jesus adds? It's the word mind. Deuteronomy says, with all your strength. Now, of course, we're to do that. But Jesus throws in this word mind. And what does it mean to love God with all your mind? Well, for one thing, it means be curious about God. Think about him. Wonder about him. You know, when you love someone, you pay attention, right? You notice. When you love someone, if they change their hairstyle or fashion or lose weight, do you notice? Yeah, you do. You ever notice how most people don't seem to be curious about God, though? I mean, they'll go days, weeks, months, years without ever wondering, is there somebody who made this whole deal? And if so, what is he like? What does he expect? Love God with all your mind, Jesus says. Think about him a lot. Read about him in the Bible. Now, Jesus' followers recognized that God thought up and created everything there is. So anytime we learn anything that's true, whether it's about nature, how creation works, about math or logic, we're actually thinking God's thoughts after him, and thus getting to know God. So learning can literally become an act of worship because it's helping us to know God and love God better. And so they loved the truth. Now, the Bible was the unique and ultimate authority, but they would also read ancient Greeks and Romans to look for wisdom because, after all truth is God's truth. And so we search for truth and follow it wherever it leads. Monasteries became places of great learning. A Jesus follower named Benedict collected so many ancient manuscripts, he became known as the godfather of libraries. And out of these monastic communities came universities, Oxford, Cambridge, a bunch of others. See, this search for truth impacted our educational legacy. And what do we actually call folks who teach in universities? What's the typical term? Professors. Professors. Interesting word. But why do we call them that? Because they have something to profess. Right? To profess means there's something I believe to be valuable and true, and it needs to be known. I have a profession to make. Jesus shaped our world in ways largely forgotten. And so, whether you think of yourself as smart or not, just love God with your mind, all your mind. As Christians, we should humbly and courageously follow the truth wherever it leads. Because if Jesus is who he said he was, and if Jesus is who he claimed to be, okay, then we have nothing to be nervous about when it comes to the honest pursuit of truth. And by the way, the worldview of Jesus is part of how science came about in our world. For some reason in our day, a lot of people think science equals rational facts and faith equals backwards, superstitious. There's this myth that they've always been enemies. But the reality is classical science arose only one time in history, in Europe, in the late 16th century. Historians have asked, why didn't it arise in India or China or Egypt or Greece? Diogenes Allen from Yale, he said this, "We have begun to realize from its very birth, science owed a great deal to Christianity." See, there were attitudes Christianity had that were indispensable for science to be able to rise. Like the idea that matter was created by a good, orderly, rational God. And therefore there's reason to expect not chaos, but order, reason, and laws in nature and in the universe. NASA sent out a telescope named after Kepler, a great mathematician and astronomer. And Kepler once wrote, I love these words, "God, like a master builder, has laid the foundation of the world according to law and order." God wanted us to recognize those laws by creating us after his image so we could share in his own thought. Isn't that cool? Love the Lord your God with all your mind. And people did. The vast majority of pioneers of science, William of Ockham, Francis Bacon, Galileo, Copernicus, Pascal, Pasteur, Isaac Newton, who wrote commentaries on the Bible, by the way. Did you know that? Isaac Newton wrote commentaries on this book right here. But they all viewed their work as learning to think God's thoughts. How did Jesus teach? With authority. Why did Jesus teach? To change lives. Who did he teach? Everyone. What did he teach? He taught truth. Nobody's teaching impacted our world like this man, Jesus, the God-man. Okay, how about one more? Let's talk about when Jesus taught. One time, the disciples were walking somewhere, and Jesus asked them in Mark 9, 33 to 34, "What were you arguing about on the road?" But they kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. So nobody wanted to fess up. You know, this is what's called a teachable moment. You see, Jesus taught all the time because the life he taught is the life he lived. So when is Jesus teaching? Right now. Right now. That means you can become his student. Let me ask you, have you made Jesus your teacher? Now, I'm not asking, are you trusting Jesus for eternal life? Are you trusting Jesus to forgive you and give you entrance into heaven when you die? No. Have you made him your teacher? Have you said, you're the one who knows? You know about life. You know about my life. So I will read what you say. I'll study it and seek to do what you tell me to do. You will be my rabbi, my teacher. You know, we all learn about life from someplace. So let me leave you with this profound question. Have you made Jesus your teacher?